Welcome everyone, this is meeting 14. Its broad title is Examination of Spaces, Scenes, and Construction of Metal Perceptions in the Global South. We have three presenters scheduled. We're going to start with our second one, PeterPichler from Austria. The title of his is South of Heaven, on the role of the Global South in the cultural history of the European integration of metal since 1970. Then from Fulya, Çelikel. Durak, the Turkish heavy metal club of 1/4 of a century. And then finally, Maria de Los Angeles Arroyo Montoya from Mexico will present counter-hegemony and subalternity, heavy metal in prison spaces.
Okay, does that work? Sounds good. Sounds good. So good morning to you all. So first of all, I want to thank the organizers. It is really great to be here. I can't imagine a more logical place to have this meeting here. So many thanks to Alfredo and his team. It really is wonderful to be here. Many thanks for having us. So the title of my paper is South of Heaven, on the role of the Global South in the cultural history of European integration of metal. So I'll just start. In 1988, the US thrash metal pioneer Slayer released a full studio album with the title track South of Heaven. In the song, the notion of the South was linked via imagination in discourse with the religious fear, with the concepts of hell and the last judgment. That means the concept of heaven there was an imagination. It was a part of discourse. To put it somewhat casually, hell for Slayer in 1988 seemed to be located somewhat south of heaven. So now today here in this conference we are gathered to talk about metal and metal studies in the Global South. We are talking about Global South studies. So like Slayer's concept of the South, also the academic concept of the Global South, how we think about the South, the theory there, this is one thing that is constructed in discourse. It is constructed in academic discourse. So of course, as we have heard in the keynote by Nelson Diaz, there's a lot of local geographies there for that notion, but also the fact is that this term, the Global South, is not fully geographically fixed. But most of all, it describes everyday practices of processes of disadvantaging people and marginalizing people in constellations of unleashed capitalism and colonialism. Briefly, one could say the Global South is wherever people are socially marginalized or exploited as a consequence of such processes. Now, in my talk, first of all, I have to say this paper developed a bit in the course of its writing. What I'm doing here, what I'm speaking about, is a bit different from the abstract that I put in. This is simply to the fact that the topic developed. It is more focused on sources and more focused on theoretical thinking. So I will try to use the analytical strengths that I see in this concept, the processual thinking of the concept of Global South studies, to highlight the dimension of the cultural history of metal in Europe, which is otherwise difficult to get into view. I think the strengths of the notion, this concept which was constructed in discourse, is this processual way of thinking, of looking at the linkages, the transfer processes between the Global South and the Global North, to which Europe is commonly ascribed to. I think the processual core of the Global South thinking is looking at those processes of transfers and open them to relations as power relations, and also open them to belief. I would like to show that this is a sort, it really is an attempt, I'm not really sure whether this will be more, whether it will be more value in further research. I would like to show that this way of thinking probably makes it possible to focus on processes of interdependence, on processes of interdependence within Europe that are difficultly otherwise to grasp. I think that probably this notion, the thinking, the look on cultural transfers between wealthier scenes and less wealthier scenes, probably makes it possible to find an explanations for contacts between metal scenes in the last phase of the Cold War for the 1980s. That means to have a new look at contacts between metal scenes in Western European countries and Eastern European countries. You have a lot of contacts there, also across the Iron Wall, and in many cases there were disequalities, a hegemony of Western culture, and I suggest that probably this line of thinking enables us to have another look at this. So I suggest that these transfers between Western, so to speak, northern metal scenes and Eastern metal scenes, so to speak, southern metal scenes, as a facet of European integration in metal, can be accessed through such thinking. So in order to unfold this argument, I have to go 3 steps. 2 smaller steps and then 1 bigger step. In the first step, I have to explain very shortly what is meant by the notion of European integration, the cultural history of European integration, and what this means for metal research and how it is relevant here. In the third and central part, which will be the biggest part of my presentation, I will use examples from my oral history research on cultural contacts between metal scenes in Austria. This was more of a Western scene, and Eastern scenes in Hungary and Yugoslavia in the 1980s to show that probably the concept of the global South gives us a new look at border zones there and can explain such processes. So let's start very, very briefly with what I mean by European integration. So if we talk of European integration, after the Second World War, which ended in Europe in May 1945 with the defeat of Nazi Germany, the European continent was largely destroyed. In the course of the post-war reconstruction, voices prevailed which wanted to prevent a new war by an ever closer union. That means there was the idea that Europe, socially, economically, politically, and so on, should be reconstructed by a new political framework that is above the nation states. So also the main idea was that Germany should be prevented from regaining military flanks through such supranational institutions. Prosperity and peace should be secured by a growing together of the European societies and the European states at large. This is a process which started in the 1950s and then all the way through the 1980s, when also the metal scenes grow all together in Europe. So this process of European integration started in the 1950s with the rather well-known European steel and coal community, which was something like a rooftop which integrated the industries that were before 1945 important for war. So the idea there with that organization was to prevent war by integrating the industries that were important for war. So this process started in the 1950s, it went all the way through the 1980s, and the key result of this is the current European Union, with which its 27 member states today is also a key player in the Ukraine war. So very, very abbreviated, European integration can be understood as the intensifying cooperation process of the European states and European societies since the 1950s. In the 1950s and 1960s, this was most of all a political and economic process. But since the 1970s, and then most of all in the 1980s, this will be the period that I will look at, this also was a social process. That means all those countries there, it were a few of them, grow together, there were more intense contacts. With the time, the national borders between the states were abolished. And this was also the time when there was more transnational interactions between member states. So, since the 1970s, there was a broad debate about European values. You also have value discussions in metal scenes, in European metal scenes, in national metal scenes, and local metal scenes. And there was a discussion about a European soul and European identity. Of course, we don't know what it should be, but most of all, those are discursive construction. The crucial point is that transnational networks of the metal scenes that became clearer in the 1980s, also in a time where there was still the Cold War, emerged in the context of this process. That means the macro process of social cultural integration in Europe was the backdrop of the development of the transnational networks, also of the metal scenes in Europe. And in this way, this is significant for the history of metal in Europe. This is what I come to my second point, which is what I mean with European integration in metal. As I have said, basically and perhaps, European integration as this process of unifying the continent is the most formative structure building process in post-war European history, and therefore it is hardly surprising that the history of metal in Europe can be thought of for the 1980s in this context. I try to conceptualize this in this book, which I projected here. Especially in the 1980s, the last phase of the Cold War, there were astonishing structural analogies between the proto-integration of Europe, that means the growing together with all the problems that was there between the European societies, and the transnational developments between the symbols, between the individual metal scenes. For example, when the metal scenes in Germany, France, Great Britain, but also in Austria, Switzerland, and the northern countries in the 1980s, developed the first clearer contours of their own scene networks, of their own scene economies, of their own scene institutions, and so on. And also the transnational interconnections that developed there, for example, via tape trading, via tours, via economies, and so on. This was exactly the time that also European integration picked up speed again. So it is really close that we think not fully of the parallelism of those processes, but for very sure there were interrelationships in the sense that I guess that European integration, the pro-social integration of Europe, was one of the founding processes also of all economic networks, political networks, touring networks, and so on, that were existing in the metal scene. So very briefly, the state of knowledge on this can be summarized at the point as follows. Very probably there was an interdependence between the process of European social cultural integration and the European networks of the metal scenes. However, there still is a great deal of empirical research to be done on what form this took in everyday life. Especially this is true for contact zones between richer metal scenes in the West, so to speak, the north, like the old scenes in Germany, in France, in Austria, and so on, and the often less wealthy scenes in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. We already had the case of Yugoslavia yesterday. I will focus on Hungary most of all. So European integration in metal here means asking for the cultural flows that happened between those things, how they interacted, how the border zones were there important, and how metal identities were developed there. I come to the main part of my presentation. In this main part, I would like to draw on interviews, on oral history interviews, which I did in the Austrian metal scene in Styria. And I would like to draw on these oral history interviews on the border regions between Austria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia in the 1980s, to show that perhaps the concept of the global south makes it possible to have a better empirical look at such processes. Now, before going into full empirical detail, it is necessary to outline a bit more clearly how the concept of the global south is used here. I think a good starting point is Anne Garland Marcus. She is a professor at the University of Virginia. Answer to the question, where is the global south? Anne Garland Marcus answers this question in the following way. The global south captures a deterritorialized geography, and it means to account for subjugated peoples such that there are economic souths in the geographic north and north in the geographic south. It is through this territorial conceptualization that it refers to the resistant imaginary of a transnational political subject that results from a shared experience. That means it is about imagination, also about imagination geographies, and exactly that what I meant before, that the global south is wherever people are marginalized, exploited, in such a sense of communism, very good, capitalism, and colonialism, and of course. So I think this quote brings the processional thinking of the global South studies to the point. It is also about looking at the history of metal, and especially of the history of metal in those border zones between the richer Western, that means northern metal scenes, and the less wealthier Eastern metal scenes, so to speak, the Southern metal scenes, in this way. It is about looking at the cultural transfer that happened there in the sense of growing together in a European sense, but also they have a critical view at this in the sense of disequalities. So for the last 2.5 years, I have been intensely engaged in a broad research project at the University of Graz on the history of the metal scene in the Austrian state, the Austrian province of Styria. And as I guess that many of you not really have an idea where this is located, I first show a map of where Austria is situated in Europe. And then here in red, this is the area where the metal scene is that I investigated now for 2.5 years. So this regional scene, which is painted in red here, now has a history for over 4 decades. And in the 1980s, it can be called quite peripheral within Europe. Peripheral in that sense that while all the globally defining trends of scene building that have developed, for example, in Britain, America, or Germany, but also in Southern Europe or elsewhere, those trends were taken up, but they were taken up to some delay. Now, I'm not interested here in telling the whole history of the scene, but I'm interested in looking at the border zones of this scene in the 1980s, in the late Cold War, to Hungary especially, and Yugoslavia. So as we heard yesterday, this map is not fully exact, because Yugoslavia, it is a bit untrue to put it fully red there, because in certain sense Yugoslavia, as a part of the non-aligned movement in the 60s to 1950s, it was a bit a case of its own. So please have a look at this a bit. So, now, I have recorded about 30 hours of interview materials on this topic. From the very beginning, I was amazed how intense the contact between metalheads, especially between metalheads in Hungary and Yugoslavia, seemed to have been already in the 1980s. Regularly, people told me of vacation stays in Hungary, of vacation stays in Yugoslavia, of meeting with metalheads there, of cheap record and merchandise purchases in Hungary, of vacations at Lake Balaton, which is a very famous lake in Hungary, and sitting there together, listening to Iron Maiden, talking about Iron Maiden, wearing the same shirts, and that these everyday practices establish a common ground, seemingly a common European ground. And also what happened often there was that they told of the special memory of the feeling of life in Yugoslavia in the summer by the sea. So, as a consistent narrative pattern, in most of those oral history interviews, the common space of metalness between the East, the South, so to speak, and the West, the North, so to speak, emerged through such deteriorated practices as Gall and Maus described them. Now, to show you how we could use the concept of the global South to analyze such sources there, I will draw on 2 oral history interviews, which I think are paradigmatic for such research. Okay, how can I go on here? Like this? Okay. So I would like to show you this now in closer detail with 2 oral history examples. First, a contemporary witness who was influenced by thrash metal in Styria, that means in southern Austria, in that border zone, from 1983 onwards. He recalled vacations in Hungary, especially at Lake Balaton, as follows. Quote, "It was mega exciting for us. So we made acquaintances there, formative experiences. In Hungary, there was everything, the tapes and the vinyls, almost at the same time as with us in Austria. You could buy their Exodus Metallicus layer on the mill in 1983, 1984. And you also had it on the village fairs as tapes. They were black presents, of course, but there were tapes of all of them, whether Destruction, whether Sodom, whether Celtic Frost. That was available at the normal village fair. That was paradise for us somehow. And now comes the crucial phrase. That was cheap for us, of course. So, these memories, end of quote, these memories of the Western and Muslim metalhead, I think, are paradigmatic. They make clear that Hungary, and especially Lake Paladon, were imagined as a metal paradise. It was apparently about the common space of metalness here. How useful the concept of the global south could be in analyzing this is when we look at aspects of economic and social experiences of inequalities that become inapparent in this narrative. We only have to consider the different economic background between the Eastern metal scenes and the Western metal scenes. For that Western interviewee, the experience could only be imagined as a metal paradise because it was cheap for him to live on a Western income in Hungary. So we have there a great economic disparity, very much in the sense of the global south. And I think this can be analyzed with what I have said. At the same time, there is another point. Only Western bands are named. There were some metal bands in Hungary too. But what is named? Exodus, Metallica, Slayer, and so on. Those are American bands. So obviously nobody wanted to talk about other bands. So you have a disparity in these terms as well. So in short, in this case, the concept of the global south, on the one hand, allows us to describe the interconnectedness of the European metal scenes, and on the other hand, at the same time, it allows us to open up this relationship to criticism in this sense. Okay, this was the first one. I come to a second oral history interview. The second contemporary witness, which I want to quote here, he remembered the political dimension of the metal scene in the 1980s, and that Yugoslavia was an important point of reference there. He told me about his military service in Austria, which he had to do in the barracks, where it seems a right-wing extremist ideology seemed to prevail, at least in part. So, quote, I was in a right-wing extremist barracks. There were neo-Nazis there. They were ranting about Yugoslavia, so there was discrimination in those terms. So, but now, yes, I had been on vacation in Yugoslavia once or twice before, and I thought it was great there. I thought the people were great there. I didn't find it funny, this xenophobia, this discrimination. And because of that discrimination, I rebelled there. That means he rebelled in the barracks as a man, end of quote. Interpreted through the lens of the global south, this quote is instructive in a number of aspects. This interviewee recalled the rebelling against injustice and xenophobia was central for his metalhead identity. But what is more crucial here, the development of that value setting was only possible through the imagination of the reference point of Yugoslavia. That means his experience with the Yugoslavian metal scene, his experience and imagination of the people in Yugoslavia were very important for the construction of his metalness identity. In short, the concept of the global south here again makes it possible to look at those contact zones between the west, the north, and the east, the south, in the sense of the normative dimension of metal. Unfortunately, that interview I did not elaborate further on what form the rebellion took, but I think this is quite an interesting code. So, for reasons of time, I have to limit myself here to these two examples. But as a conclusion, what I hoped I could try to show a bit is that the contacts between Western, so to speak, northern metal scenes in Europe and southern, so to speak, Eastern metal scenes probably could be analyzed better by the concept of the global south. That's it from my point of view. Many thanks. gases.
I've got questions for both of you. I'll start with Peter. If you were to measure the cultural flow of metal from one country to another, what are the kind of things you'd look to that could be counted and tracked over time?
Thank you for the question. I guess this is a very important question. In fact, you always have to everyday practices what elements flow around there. Music albums, t-shirts, what the metal horns, they worked in Hungary, they worked in Austria. Look at the everyday presence, how metalness identity is represented. And also it is important just look at the narratives and how those everyday practices are represented here. So I think, for example, for the source that I quoted here, it is highly paradigmatic that only Western bands are named there, not even Austrian bands, only American bands. That says so much about the globalization of metal. Where does it come from the North? And you can question that by the concept of the global South. So the methodology that I'm following here is doing oral history in a very traditional sense, combining it with a discourse analysis. That means looking at band t-shirts, how they were sold, but also what I think, which is a bit lost in metal studies at that current point, you always need a structural view. It doesn't make sense to only look at the local. Of course, the local is important, but you also have to look at the systems there. So what I try to show is that the macro processes and the local always interact. And if you combine this quite cleverly, you come to such conclusions, I guess. That would be my answer to that. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, we get a workout.
Because over from 1983 to present, a lot of things have changed over time. So there'd be more things than just band t-shirts and albums. I mean, there'd be a lot of other things. I don't know what all of them would be. But you kind of go from one to another. I mean, I can think of like tours and who's doing stuff like that. But I'm thinking of much more, just measuring something over a long period, so you can kind of draw a little graph and a chart and kind of see this was at 1983, 1984, and so on. No, this is back here.
This is perfectly true, a lot changed, but the point here is you have to do a little selection here. First of all, you have to choose between different kinds of sources, and then I decided on focus on sources that really are important in metal culture. What is important for metalness identities? Those are band t-shirts, those are depictions on album covers, those are the feeling of the sound that always was very important. So I was wondering, for example, yesterday at the presentation of Kočana, the sounds you presented there, the metal in Yugoslavia, it sounded perfectly like Hungarian metal, so I could play the sound there. So you really have to focus on what is important. You have to choose sources that say something about the metalness identity, and there you have to choose from. And also another point is, of course, it is very true, the situation in the 1990s will be very different, and research is not done for this yet. So I really had to focus with this paper on this period, because I think, if we think of power relations, there's a lot of tell for the history of metal in that period, not only in Europe, but many other zones of the world too. Thank you. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for the very informative talks. I have a question for Peter. Something that popped up repeatedly throughout this conference was the importance for, when we're dealing with the global north and global south, was the importance of accepting and extending different knowledges and different forms of knowledge. And in your recent book title, you mentioned sonic knowledges. So my two questions would be, what is your notion of sonic knowledge? And on the other hand, what would you see the kind of potential to extend hegemonic forms of knowledge?
Thank you, that is a very good question. So the point, I don't have the time to go into full details on the this concept of the sonic knowledge here. But the point here is, and this is written in this book, that in many cases I have the feeling that in matter studies, that historical processes are not looked at into their whole depth. We really have to focus also on long-term processes. And what I want to say with the term of sonic knowledge is that sonic knowledge is all the intuitive knowledge that we have of metal, like doing this, or like listening abilities, like the shoes we wear. If we see somebody that is a metalhead, we know that he is a metalhead, but that is always connected to the music, and therefore it is sonic knowledge. And the idea with sonic knowledge is that these processes, how they change over periods of time, this takes a lot of time, but usually this is the kind of knowledge that keeps the scenes together. And they vary over different scenes. For example, the scene that I looked at, the Styrian scene, of course, you have their Iron Maiden shirts, and you also have very local shirts where the place of the state of Styria is printed onto t-shirts, or where the local dialect is combined with metalness identity. And that is that kind of knowledge that changes over periods, changes usually over periods of 10 years. And I think this is also an important message for metal studies, that we not only have to look at, I don't know, like a scene in 1980 and not be interested in what happens in 1985, but looking at the whole process of history. That would be what is there with the notion of sonic knowledge. It is kind of an answer, at least, in a very short time.
Yes, thanks. Anyone else?
Yo solo. Bueno, gracias por las ponencias. Yo solo tengo un comentario, bueno, más bien dos comentarios. Uno, el primero está relacionado con la ponencia de Peter. Y siendo cubana, por supuesto, me es muy fácil relacionar también el contexto político que trabajas en Europa del Este, digamos, a finales de los años 80, cuando también hay un interrumbe del campo socialista. Y por supuesto, creo que hay conexiones también directas con lo que pasa en la isla en ese momento. Entonces, quizás no para hablarlo ahora, pero como siempre me queda la interrogante en torno a de qué manera ese contexto también influyó en la escucha del metal y en la aproximación a la escucha. Pero aunque no te pido ahondar en eso ahora, lo podemos hablar por el pasillo, digamos, sí me queda también un segundo comentario que tiene que ver con esto que hablabas del conocimiento sonoro y de cómo se va conformando una hegemonía sonora a nivel global. Y hay algo que a mí me pasa también con esta temática, y por eso he tratado de diseccionar la manera de observar esto como en dos caminos. Y uno tiene que ver con las mediaciones estructurales de la escena global, que ahí entraría la industria y ese proceso de canonización de un sonido. Sin embargo, por otro lado, creo que ya pensando también metodológicamente en cómo aproximarnos también a esa inmersión y a ese conocimiento sonoro, en estudiar más la microhistoria y entrar más a los archivos de la gente, o sea, los archivos que tiene la gente, esa acumulación de lo que escuchan, va a dar de alguna manera algo muy distinto a lo que supuestamente vemos, observamos como prácticas cotidianas, con lo que representa también posiblemente una playera o una mercancía aquí vendida por la industria. O sea, hay cosas que a veces desde la iconografía lo demás se parecen a lo industrial, pero están hablando de otra forma de escucha, otro tipo de escucha, y que cuando nos relacionamos con esos archivos más personales, ahí encontramos entonces puede ser que ese mainstream esté. Sin embargo, creo que también ese proceso de invención y de conocimiento sonoro está hablando de que el mito de esa escucha más mainstream es solo eso, un mito. O sea, hay una escucha subterránea que los archivos hablan de ello. Y por eso te quería comentar eso, porque a mí me ha pasado en mi investigación. A partir de ahí he encontrado que en el primer momento dicen player, dicen certifrog, que de hecho es Suiza, pero después hay un baúl de música que te va diciendo, que te va adentrando en otras direcciones. Entonces creo que esa historia personal, ese archivo, es fundamental también. Solo ese comentario.
In a sense of time, I will comment on them. I will try to keep myself short. So first of all, I simply have to say I do not know much enough about the Cuban metal scene to really give a good answer to that. So we really would have to talk about this. I really don't know about this. The other point is, and this is quite important to me, you mentioned that you, for example, one cannot really make sense of a band t-shirt or, for example, of a consent flyer in the sense of sonic knowledge. I would say still, we have to, because a metal scene is a symbolic universe. And look, for example, at the metal shirts. The content is there usually an album cover, strictly refers to music, so it does not make sense at all to interpret a t-shirt or a concert flyer or a concert poster without the reference to the music, and also without it how also refers to the listening. So for example, take an oral history interview. I have asked my people, what values do you address, do you attach to listening to metal? Then they explained me this via, for example, metal shirts. So what we really have to do, also when going to archives, when going to rework history, we have to try to unwrap this whole symbolic universe. And that is sonic knowledge. I think we can only refer to one dimension of that. We really have to see like the semiotics of the whole scene. That is sonic knowledge. And what I also want to say there, you said the hegemonic knowledge. To be honest, that concept that I followed here is not so much about hegemonics, of course, that is their emphasis in the concept of the global south, but most of all, the theory that I worked with is really to understand how metal scenes work in a historical perspective. No more, no less. Not so much about hegemonics there. The hegemonics come into play when we talk about the global south concept. That would be my answer. Thank you.
Folks, we're out of time. Thank you for a great discussion.
Seguir pensando.
Thanks.